Chapter 1. Echoes. Noah Mercer. People think profiling is about reading faces. They're wrong. Faces lie. Expressions can be rehearsed. Voices can be controlled. Even fear can be manufactured if someone has enough practice. Behavior is different. Behavior tells the truth because most people never realize they're revealing it. That lesson came from my mother long before I ever stepped inside Quantico. She used to tell me that everyone leaves fingerprints, not on glass or doorknobs, on decisions. I didn't understand what she meant until years later. Now I couldn't stop looking for them. By 8 o'clock, the briefing was over. Mara had kept it short. Someone inside the Department of Justice had flagged an incident for our review. On paper, it looked ordinary. Federal Judge Samuel Whitlock had abruptly dismissed a corruption case against a defense contractor after months of testimony. Judges reverse themselves all the time. Just not like this. Whitlock had spent 8 months building the government's case. Then, after a 23-minute recess, he'd returned to the bench and dismantled every argument he'd previously agreed with. No explanation, no legal basis. Just a different man. The case had landed on my desk because behavior that changed without explanation was my job. I left Washington before 9. The drive south gave me time to study the file again. Whitlock wasn't impulsive. Every clerk who had worked with him described the same qualities. Methodical, patient, predictable. He rarely interrupted attorneys, never raised his voice, never ruled from emotion. His opinions were so carefully reasoned that appellate courts often cited them years later. People like that don't suddenly reverse themselves. Something changes first. The question was what? The courthouse in Alexandria was already busy when I arrived. Lawyers hurried through security, carrying overstuffed briefcases. Reporters lingered near the entrance, hoping for a story that probably wouldn't happen. Deputy marshals moved through the lobby with practiced efficiency. Ordinary. Everything felt ordinary. That bothered me. Conspiracies survive because they hide inside ordinary places. I checked in with courthouse security and introduced myself to the supervising marshal, Robert Gaines. Gaines looked over my credentials before handing them back. Washington keeps sending people. I'm not here to reopen the case, I said. Good. He smiled politely. Because the newspapers already tried. As we walked toward the judge's corridor, I asked the question that had bothered me since reading the case file. Judge Whitlock took a recess before issuing the dismissal. 23 minutes, he said. What did he do? Gaines shrugged. What judges usually do? And what's that? I asked. They think. It was a reasonable answer, too reasonable. When was the last time anyone actually saw him before he returned? Gaines thought for a moment. His clerk dropped off coffee. Did she go inside? I asked. No. Why not? The door was locked. He kept walking. It wasn't unusual enough for anyone to remember until afterward. That stopped me. I looked back toward the hallway we'd just entered. People remember unusual things. They don't remember routine. Unless something only became unusual in hindsight. I thanked Gaines and continued toward Judge Whitlock's chambers, alone. The hallway was quiet now. Court had already begun. Most of the offices stood empty. As I reached the judge's door, I noticed someone emerge from a maintenance closet at the far end of the corridor. Blue work shirt, toolbox, county identification badge. Nothing remarkable. Except he never looked at the light fixture he'd supposedly been repairing. He looked at me. Not for long. Maybe a second. Then he smiled politely, nodded once, and continued walking toward the service hallway. I watched him disappear around the corner before looking back at Judge Whitlock's office. Something told me the judge could wait. I turned and followed the maintenance man. Chapter 2. The Tale. The maintenance worker never looked back. Most people know when they're being followed. They glance into windows, pause at intersections, or invent reasons to turn around. Even trained investigators do it. They can't help themselves. The instinct to verify what you already suspect is difficult to suppress. This man never verified anything. He simply kept walking. I stayed half a corridor behind him as he moved through a set of double doors marked Authorized Personnel and into a quieter section of the courthouse that connected the judge's chambers with administrative offices. The bustle of attorneys and jurors faded behind me, replaced by the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rhythm of air handlers hidden somewhere above the ceiling. He stopped only once, not to examine an electrical panel, not to check his work order. He stopped beside a large window overlooking the employee parking lot. For several seconds, he simply stood there, watching. I slowed without stopping, pretending to study a framed historical photograph hanging on the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the reflection in the glass. He wasn't looking at the parking lot. He was watching the entrance to the courthouse, waiting for someone. A black SUV pulled into the reserved parking area below. The maintenance worker watched it until the driver disappeared inside. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he continued walking. Whatever he'd been waiting for had just arrived. I followed him another 50 yards before he disappeared through a gray steel door leading into the building's service corridors. By the time I reached it, the hallway beyond was empty. No footsteps, no closing doors, nothing. It was as though he'd dissolved into the building itself. I stood there for a moment, listening. Silence. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with electrical rooms, storage closets, and maintenance access panels. Every door looked identical. No security cameras were visible, although that didn't mean much anymore. After Martin Voss, I had stopped assuming I could see everyone watching me. My phone buzzed. It was Evie. I answered quietly. "Tell me you found something." "I found a lot of something," she replied. I could hear keyboards clicking beneath her voice. "The county says that maintenance contractor doesn't work for them." I frowned. "Temporary employee?" I checked. "Subcontractor?" I checked that too. "So who is he?" "That's the problem," she paused. "I don't think he exists." I looked down the empty corridor again. "What do you mean he doesn't exist?" "I ran the ID number on the badge you're wearing on your body camera. It belongs to a county employee." "That's good." "No," she said. Her voice sharpened. "The employee is a woman." I stopped walking. "What?" 42 years old, works in facilities management." Another pause. "She's been on medical leave for almost 3 months." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "So the badge is real?" "Yes." "But the man wearing it isn't." Before I could respond, a metallic sound echoed somewhere deeper in the corridor. A door closing. Not loudly, carefully. I lowered my voice. "I've got movement." "Where?" "North end of the service hall." "Noah," Evie hesitated. "Mara's going to tell you to wait." "I know." "I'm serious." "So am I." She sighed. "I've already called her." I figured. I slipped the phone into my jacket, but left the connection open. Evie didn't need to say another word. She knew I wasn't turning around. The corridor ended at a heavy fire door that opened into the courthouse basement. The air immediately became cooler. Concrete walls replaced painted drywall, and the smell of dust and machine oil lingered in the still air, Utility lines ran overhead in neat rows, while pipes disappeared into darkness farther down the passage. About 30 feet ahead, the maintenance worker reappeared. He hadn't heard me. He was standing outside a locked records room with his toolbox resting at his feet. Instead of removing a tool, he produced a ring of keys. Not one key, dozens. He sorted through them with practiced familiarity until selecting a small brass key that opened the government lock in less than 2 seconds. That alone was enough to make my pulse quicken. Maintenance workers don't carry master keys to federal records rooms. The man slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind him. I reached the doorway less than a minute later. The lock had clicked shut. I crouched beside it. The brass around the keyhole was polished smooth. Not from age, from frequent use. Someone had been entering this room for a very long time. I pressed my ear against the door. At first I heard nothing. Then, the faint rustle of paper. Not boxes being moved. Not files being searched frantically. Paper being turned. One page at a time. Whoever was inside knew exactly what he had come to retrieve. And suddenly I realized something that hadn't occurred to me until then. He hadn't come to hide evidence. He'd come to remove it. Somewhere inside that records room was a file he could not allow anyone else to find. Chapter 3. The File. There are moments during an investigation when experience tells you to wait for backup. Then there are moments when waiting guarantees you'll lose the only chance you're ever going to get. This felt like the second kind. I stepped away from the records room door and studied the corridor. No cameras, no passing employees. Just concrete walls, humming fluorescent lights, and a hallway that seemed forgotten by everyone except the man now standing somewhere inside. I pulled out my phone and quietly whispered, "Evie." "I'm here," she replied. "I've got him inside a federal records room." "What kind of records room?" she asked. "I don't know yet." I heard her typing almost immediately. "Give me the room number." I looked at the small brass plaque bolted beside the door. B14. The keyboard stopped. "That's strange." "What is?" "There isn't supposed to be a B14. I frowned. "What do you mean there isn't?" "The courthouse blueprints jump from B12 to B15. I looked at the sign again. The numbers were old, original to the building. "This room has existed for decades," I said. "I know." She sounded just as confused. "But according to every floor plan I can access, it doesn't. A hidden room, not physically hidden, administratively hidden. Someone had erased it from the building records while leaving the room itself untouched. That took planning and authority." I slipped my lockpicks from my wallet. One of the few habits I'd picked up from instructors who believed investigators should understand how criminals thought. 2 tension adjustments, a gentle lift. The deadbolt clicked. Evie heard it through the phone. "You didn't," she said. "I did." "Noah? If Mara asks, I'm telling her. I assumed you would." I eased the door open no more than 2 inches. Cool, stale air drifted into the hallway. The room beyond wasn't large. Rows of metal shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, each packed tightly with gray archival boxes marked with handwritten dates. The labels weren't arranged alphabetically or by agency. They were arranged by year. The maintenance worker stood with his back to me near the far end of the room. His toolbox rested on the floor while he leafed through a thin collection of folders with calm, deliberate movements. He wasn't searching. He already knew exactly where the file belonged. I opened the door another inch. His shoulders remained relaxed. No sign he'd heard me. My eyes scanned the nearest shelves. Most of the boxes carried ordinary federal archive markings. Court administration, judicial appointments, budget reports. Then one label stopped me. It had been typed on an aging strip of white tape. Meridian Liaison. Not Project Meridian, not classified, just Meridian Liaison. As though it had been another government office. Whatever this room was, it wasn't storing evidence, it was storing history. The maintenance worker finally removed a single manila folder from the shelf. He looked at it for only a second before placing it inside his toolbox. Not a stack. One folder. One specific file. He quietly closed the lid. Then, for the first time since entering the room, he spoke. "I know you're there." His voice was calm, almost conversational. I didn't move. He continued without turning around. Most people would have waited outside. I slowly pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "So you expected me," I said. "I expected someone." He turned. His expression was neither surprised nor hostile. It was curious. "You followed me much sooner than I anticipated." I kept several feet between us. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "I've had many names." "Which one are you using today?" "The one on the badge works well enough." His answer wasn't evasive, it was practiced. The kind of response someone gives after decades of avoiding the same question. My attention shifted briefly toward the toolbox. He noticed. "You're interested in the file." "I am." "You won't understand it." "You don't know that." "No." He nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose I don't." Silence settled between us, not tense, measured, each of us studying the other. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. "Why remove it now?" His smile disappeared. Because someone finally started asking the right questions. Those words settled heavily in the room. He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about the task force, about Mara, about Voss, about Selene. Whoever this man was, he had been watching our investigation long before we'd realized we were part of one ourselves. He rested a hand on the toolbox. "I imagine Martin Voss told you something before he died." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Why would you think that?" "Because he always believed the truth should outlive the people protecting it." He looked directly into my eyes. "So..." His voice remained perfectly calm. "Did he tell you she was alive?" Chapter 4. The Keeper. The question caught me off guard, not because of what he asked, but because of how he asked it. There was no urgency in his voice. No attempt to intimidate me. He wasn't fishing for information, nor did he sound like someone confirming a suspicion. It felt more like he already knew the answer and wanted to know whether I would tell the truth. I kept my expression neutral. "You knew Martin Voss." The man rested both hands on the handle of the toolbox and gave a slight nod. "A long time ago." "Did you work with him?" "I worked around him." Avoiding the question doesn't answer it. He smiled faintly. "No, Agent Mercer, it usually creates a better one." I had met people like him before, intelligence officers, diplomats, career interrogators. They survive by answering just enough of a question to make you ask another. Every conversation became a negotiation over information. "You've been watching us," I said. "You knew we'd come looking for Voss." "I knew someone eventually would." "And when he died?" For the first time since I'd entered the room, the man's eyes drifted away from mine. He looked down at the floor for only a moment before answering. "Martin always believed the truth should be preserved." He paused. "I believed it should be protected." There was something genuine in the way he said it. Not guilt, regret. I took a slow step closer. "Protected from whom?" His eyes met mine again. That's the question that consumed Martin. And yours? My question was whether humanity was ready to know it. I studied him carefully. His breathing never changed. His posture remained relaxed. He wasn't afraid. People hiding a lie often become rigid. They unconsciously prepare themselves for confrontation. This man wasn't preparing for anything. He had already accepted whatever happened next. My phone vibrated softly inside my jacket. I didn't answer it. He noticed anyway. Your friends are worried. They should be, I countered. I suppose they should. Again, no denial, no irritation, only quiet agreement. You aren't Meridian, I said. The corners of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. No. You never were. Another pause. I never said that, he said. Interesting. He hadn't confirmed it. He hadn't denied it. You removed that file because you don't want us reading it. No. He rested one hand on the toolbox. I removed it because someone else would. That answer gave me pause. You expect someone else to come here? I asked. I know they will. Who? Instead of answering, he looked toward the open record shelves lining the room. When governments decide something is dangerous, they destroy it. His gaze shifted back to me. When conspiracies decide something is dangerous. He left the sentence unfinished. He didn't have to finish it. The silence completed it for him. I glanced at the toolbox again. What's in the file? He considered me for several seconds before speaking. Not what you think. I'd rather decide that myself, I said. I'm sure you would. Another long silence settled between us before he slowly opened the toolbox. Inside was a single weathered folder secured with faded cloth tape. Years of handling had softened the edges until the cardboard had almost become leather. There were no classification stamps, no agency markings, only a handwritten date. March 14th, 1968. He lifted the folder carefully, almost respectfully. This isn't a Meridian file. I frowned. No? It predates Meridian. He turned it over in his hands. Quite a bit. The statement sent my thoughts racing. Meridian had always been our starting point, but this was the first physical evidence suggesting someone inside the government had known about the gift before Meridian officially existed. What is it? I asked quietly. The man looked down at the folder one last time before extending it toward me. It's a recruitment report. I didn't reach for it. A recruitment report? Yes, he said. Recruiting whom? His eyes met mine again. The first people the government believed possessed the gift. I felt my pulse quicken. You've read it? Many times. And you're giving it to me? His expression softened for the first time. I'm giving it to someone who might finally understand why it was written. Before I could take the folder, a sharp metallic clang echoed somewhere beyond the records room. Not inside. Outside. The man's eyes immediately shifted toward the door. The warmth disappeared from his face. They're early. I instinctively looked over my shoulder. Who? He didn't answer. Instead, he quietly placed the folder into my hands. Leave through the rear archive exit. I frowned. There isn't one. But there is. He pointed toward the back of the room where a narrow steel door blended almost perfectly into the shelving. I'll keep them busy. My grip tightened on the folder. Why are you helping me? For the first time since we'd met. He smiled. Not because he'd been asked, because he already knew the answer. Because Martin Voss was right. His eyes drifted toward the folder, now resting in my hands. The truth. He looked back at me. Should outlive the people protecting it. Before I could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps entered the hallway outside. Not one person. Several. And whoever they were, they weren't there to search the records room. They already knew exactly what they were looking for. Chapter 5. The Escape. The footsteps were disciplined. They weren't rushing, yet they weren't cautious either. Whoever was approaching wasn't clearing the hallway or reacting to a possible intruder. They were moving with confidence, the kind that comes from already knowing what's waiting on the other side of the door. The man across from me seemed to recognize the rhythm as well. Whatever calm he'd maintained throughout our conversation had disappeared. His eyes shifted once toward the rear of the archive before returning to me. "They'll search the room first," he said quietly. "That gives you less than a minute." I glanced toward the narrow steel door hidden behind the shelving. It blended so naturally into the wall that I would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing it. "You could come with me," I suggested. He smiled, though this time there was sadness behind it. "If I disappear today, they'll know I gave you the file. If they find me here, they'll believe they interrupted another routine inspection." "You really think they'll believe that?" "No." He chuckled softly. "But they'll waste time pretending they do." The footsteps stopped outside the archive. Someone tried the handle, locked. A second later came 3 deliberate knocks, not loud, not impatient. Just enough to let the person inside know they weren't leaving. The man looked toward the door, but made no effort to answer it. Instead, he reached into his jacket and removed a small brass key attached to a worn leather tag. He handed it to me along with the folder. "You'll need this once." I looked at the key, then back at him. "What does it open?" "If I told you now, you wouldn't believe me." Before I could ask another question, the knocking came again. This time a voice echoed through the archive. "Facilities." The man beside me laughed under his breath. "They've never been very imaginative." Another knock followed. "Open the door." The tone had changed, still controlled, far less polite. I tucked the folder securely inside my jacket while slipping the brass key into my pocket. "If I leave," I asked quietly, "how do I find you again?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You don't." "I have questions," I said. "I know." "You know who Selene is?" His eyes softened. I knew Selene. The choice of words wasn't accidental. He continued before I could press him. "The woman you're looking for hasn't been that person in a very long time." A heavy object struck the archive door. The steel vibrated against its frame. Someone outside had abandoned courtesy. The man pointed toward the hidden exit. "Go." I didn't move. He sighed. "You're wondering whether you can trust me," he said. "I am." "You shouldn't." That answer surprised me. He saw it immediately. "You shouldn't trust anyone connected to Meridian." "You said you weren't Meridian." "I said I'm not Meridian. Anymore." The room fell silent, except for the pounding now echoing against the door. That single word, "anymore," it changed everything. He had been part of it, not a guard, not an observer, part of it. The archive door shuddered again. This time the hinges groaned. "We're out of time," he said. I looked once toward the front entrance, then toward the concealed exit. Every instinct told me to stay. Every lesson I'd learned as an investigator told me something different. Protect the evidence. You can always interview a witness later. You rarely get a second chance to recover what they were trying to hide. I crossed to the hidden door and slid the brass key into the lock. It turned effortlessly. The latch released with a muted click. Cold air drifted through the opening. Before stepping through, I looked back one final time. The man had returned the toolbox to the floor and was calmly placing ordinary courthouse records across the table, as though he'd spent the afternoon organizing files. He glanced up and noticed me watching. "One last thing, Agent Mercer." I waited. "When you read that folder..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Pay attention to the names that aren't there." Before I could ask what he meant, the archive door burst inward. Voices filled the room. "Federal agents, don't move." I slipped through the hidden doorway and quietly closed it behind me. The passage beyond was narrow, built from old concrete and brick that predated the courthouse itself. A single row of dim utility lights stretched into the distance, illuminating what looked less like an escape tunnel and more like an abandoned service corridor from another era. Behind me, I could hear muffled shouting. Someone demanded identification. Someone else ordered the room searched. Then, silence. Not because the search was over, because whoever had entered had just realized the archive wasn't missing a file. It was missing the one person they had come to stop from taking it. I tightened my grip on the folder inside my jacket and started down the tunnel. For the first time since joining Mara's task force, I wasn't chasing the mystery anymore. I was carrying a piece of it. Chapter 6: The Recruitment Report. The tunnel ended beneath an abandoned loading dock behind the courthouse. Rusted rails disappeared beneath cracked concrete where delivery trucks had once backed into the building decades earlier. Whatever purpose the passage had originally served had long been forgotten, which made it the perfect escape route. The steel door closed behind me with a dull thud, leaving only the distant sounds of traffic filtering in from the street above. I didn't stop walking until I reached my rental car. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. My phone vibrated almost immediately. "Mara." I answered before the second ring. "Tell me you're outside," she said, worried. "I'm outside." Her relief lasted exactly 1 second. "Now tell me why Reed found an empty archive room and 3 federal agents demanding to know who authorized our investigation." "I can explain," I stated. "I sincerely hope so," she replied. Her tone wasn't angry, it was controlled. That usually meant she was much more concerned than she wanted anyone else to know. "I'm heading back," I said. "No." The answer came immediately. "Read whatever you took before you come home." I frowned. "You already know I found something?" "I know you well enough to assume you didn't crawl through a hidden tunnel, empty-handed." Despite everything that had happened, I smiled. "I'll call you in an hour." "We'll be waiting." The line went dead. I drove 20 miles before stopping at a small roadside park overlooking the Potomac. Families wandered the walking trails, while fishermen stood quietly along the shoreline. It was ordinary enough that no one paid attention to another government sedan parked beneath a line of oak trees. I removed the folder from inside my jacket. Years of handling had softened the cardboard cover until it bent easily beneath my fingers. The handwritten date remained the only marking. March 14th, 1968. Nothing else. No agency. No classification. No project name. Inside were fewer than 30 pages. The first page surprised me. It wasn't a report, it was a letter. Typed, unsigned. Addressed simply, "To whoever continues this work." I began reading. "If you are holding these documents, then someone has decided the truth should survive longer than the institution protecting it. That decision carries consequences. Read carefully. The author wasted no time. The individuals listed in these pages were not selected because they possessed unusual intelligence, physical ability, or psychological resilience. They were selected because each demonstrated evidence of a phenomenon our researchers cannot adequately explain." I turned the page. The next sheet contained names, 23 of them. Beside each name were 3 columns: observed, confirmed, recovered. I frowned. Recovered? Most entries were marked only under observed. A handful carried checks beneath confirmed. Only 2 had been marked recovered. One name immediately stood out: Selene Ward, confirmed, not recovered. My pulse quickened. There was no photograph, no biography. Only a series of handwritten observations beneath her name. Exceptional awareness. Identifies others without prior contact. Demonstrates resistance. Further observation not recommended. Resistance. Resistance to what? I kept reading. Several pages later, another familiar name appeared. Not Martin Voss, not Nathaniel, not Mara. Someone I'd never expected to find: Elias Vale, Mara's father. I stared at the page. His name wasn't listed as observed or confirmed. Instead, someone had written a single sentence beside it: recommended as future investigator, not a candidate. I leaned back against the driver's seat. The implications were staggering. Mara's father hadn't stumbled onto Meridian years later. Someone had noticed him decades before he ever began investigating it. The realization sent me back through every conversation we'd ever had, every story he'd told me about old cases, every coincidence that suddenly didn't feel accidental anymore. My phone rang again. This time it wasn't Mara, it was my mother. Helen Mercer rarely called during working hours. I answered immediately. "Mom?" Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it I'd never heard before. "Noah, where are you?" I looked instinctively through the windshield. "Virginia." "Good." The word caught me off guard. "I need you to stay there." "What?" "Don't come back to Washington." I sat forward. "Why?" She hesitated. Long enough for me to realize she was choosing her words with extraordinary care. Finally she spoke. "Because someone has just entered my office." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. "They're asking questions about you." Silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Helen Mercer said the last thing I expected to hear. "They know you have the file." The line went dead. Chapter 7. Home Front. For several seconds I simply stared at the phone. The call had disconnected, but I kept it pressed against my ear as though my mother might still be there. Helen Mercer wasn't prone to panic. In 20 years of watching her navigate Washington politics, hostile congressional hearings, and national security crises, I had never once heard uncertainty in her voice. I'd heard it just now. She hadn't warned me because she was afraid for herself. She'd warned me because she believed I was already in danger. I immediately called her back, straight to voicemail. I tried again. The same result. By the 4th attempt, I stopped dialing. If someone had entered her office while we were speaking, the last thing she needed was a phone ringing in the middle of whatever conversation she was trying to survive. Instead, I called Mara. She answered before the first ring had finished. "Noah?" "My mother just called," I reported. The urgency in my voice was enough. Mara didn't interrupt. "Someone walked into her office asking questions about me." "What kind of questions?" she asked. "I don't know." She ended the call before she could explain. Mara was silent for a moment. I could almost picture her pacing the operations room, turning possibilities over in her mind. "Did she sound frightened?" "No," I replied. That answer surprised even me. Concerned, yes. Careful, definitely. But not frightened. I continued. "That tells us something," Mara stated. "What?" "If she wasn't afraid..." Mara paused. Then she recognized whoever walked into her office. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. She was right. A stranger would have triggered alarms. A familiar face required caution. "I need to go back to Washington," I said. "No," Her answer came without hesitation. They're expecting you to do exactly that. My mother can take care of herself. The statement wasn't dismissive. It was factual. I've worked with Helen Mercer long enough for me to know she doesn't scare easily. I couldn't argue. She was right again. What about the file? Have you finished reading it? Not yet, I answered. Then finish it. The line went quiet. Finally, Mara added, Whatever that man risked his life to hand you, it's more important than getting back here quickly. She disconnected before I could respond. I looked down at the folder resting on the passenger seat. Upon further investigation, I noticed something I'd missed before. The pages weren't numbered. At first it seemed insignificant. Then I realized why it mattered. Government reports are always numbered. Every page, every attachment, every appendix. This wasn't a report. It was a collection. Someone had assembled these documents over years, maybe decades, adding to them whenever new information surfaced. I flipped past the recruitment lists until I reached several handwritten notes tucked loosely between two pages. The handwriting changed. Different author, different ink. The first sentence was underlined twice. Subjects should never be informed of one another. Beneath it, another note had been scribbled in the margin. Unless one begins identifying the others. My thoughts immediately went to Selene. She could reach outward. She could sense others who possessed the gift. Meridian hadn't discovered that ability. They'd observed it. Another page? Another handwritten note. Avoid family clusters whenever possible. Genetic concentration increases the probability of recognition. I frowned. Family clusters? The phrase sounded clinical, like something written by a scientist studying inherited traits. Then I saw the list beneath it. 3 surnames. Ward, Vale, Mercer. I felt my heartbeat quicken. I read the names again. Ward, Vale, Mercer. Not individuals, families. My family. Mara's family. Selene's family. Before I could process the implications, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no signature, just a single sentence. Your mother just bought you 30 minutes. Don't waste them. I looked around the park instinctively. Children still played near the river. An older couple walked a trail with their dog. A fisherman cast his line into the water as though nothing in the world had changed. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet someone knew exactly where I was. And somehow, they also knew my mother had warned me of possible danger. Chapter 8. The Safe House. By the time I reached the safe house, it was nearly dark. The drive back had given me too much time to think. Every mile seemed to introduce another contradiction. The file suggested Meridian had been identifying families long before the program officially existed. My mother had been approached by someone who already knew I possessed the documents. Then there was the man in the courthouse. He'd admitted he had once been part of Meridian, yet he'd risked everything to ensure the file reached me instead of whoever had come looking for it. Nothing fit together. At least not yet. Reed met me in the garage before I had the chance to reach the elevator. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was doing. His eyes immediately dropped to the messenger bag hanging from my shoulder. You still have it? I nodded. Good. He turned toward the elevator. Come on. We rode to the operations floor in silence. Reed wasn't much for conversation under the best circumstances, but something about his posture told me he was carrying more than concern. He looked irritated. Not at me. At himself. As the elevator doors opened, Mara and Carver were already waiting. Cross stood beside the conference table with several legal pads spread in front of him, while Evie occupied the far end of the room, typing faster than I'd ever seen before. Nobody spoke until the conference room door closed behind us. Mara looked directly at me. "Tell us everything." I placed the folder on the table without opening it. The maintenance worker knew Martin Voss. Carver's eyebrows lifted slightly. He admitted that? He admitted enough. I recounted everything that had happened inside the archive room, careful to separate what I'd observed from what I'd concluded. Profilers learn early that assumptions are dangerous when they begin masquerading as facts. I described the hidden records room, the file, the conversation, and the warning before the federal agents forced me through the concealed exit. Nobody interrupted. When I finished, Cross reached for the folder as though it were an artifact inside a museum. "May I?" I nodded. He opened it carefully, reading the first page before turning to the recruitment list. His eyes narrowed almost immediately. "This isn't a personnel file." "No," I said. "It's an assessment." I watched him continue through the pages until he stopped abruptly. His finger rested beside 3 surnames: Ward, Vale, Mercer. Cross looked up at me. "You didn't mention this on the phone." I wanted everyone to see it together. Carver leaned over his shoulder. "What are we looking at?" Cross slid the folder toward the center of the table. "The author wasn't tracking individuals." He tapped each surname in turn. They were tracking bloodlines. The room became noticeably quieter. My father had once told me that investigators should pay close attention to the questions people choose not to ask. No one asked whether the list was authentic. No one questioned where it came from. Everyone accepted it. Instead, Mara asked the only question that mattered. "Why those families?" Nobody answered. Cross slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I think we're asking the wrong question." He looked toward me. "The report isn't telling us who Meridian wanted." He paused. "It's telling us who they were afraid of." The words settled over the room like a weight. For the first time all evening, Evie stopped typing. "I've got something." Every head turned toward her. She rotated one of her monitors until we could all see it. "I've been pulling archived personnel records from every agency we found that had connections to Meridian." She clicked through several photographs. Scientists, military officers, psychologists, and administrators. Then she stopped. "This one." The image showed a woman standing outside what appeared to be a government conference in the early 1980s. She wore a visitor badge clipped to her jacket and was speaking with 2 men whose faces had been partially obscured by age. Mara leaned closer. "I know her." "So do I," I said quietly. Cross looked between us. "Who is she?" Mara never took her eyes off the photograph. "That's my mother." Silence filled the room. Not because anyone doubted her. Because no one had expected it. The date beneath the photograph read 1984. Years before Mara was born, years before Meridian officially expanded. Carver folded his arms. "Has Helen ever mentioned knowing your mother?" "No," Mara said softly. I looked back at the photograph. The woman was smiling, completely unaware that decades later, her daughter would be standing in a safe house trying to understand why she'd been standing among people connected to Meridian. Then I noticed something else. Someone had been cropped out of the photograph. Not accidentally, but deliberately. You could still see the edge of a shoulder, part of an arm. Whoever had removed that person wanted them forgotten. I didn't know why, but I had the unmistakable feeling they were the most important person in the picture. Chapter 9: The Watcher. The others eventually drifted toward their offices, computer terminals, or whatever quiet corner of the safe house they used when their thoughts became too loud. Mara remained in the conference room with the photograph of her mother spread across the table, while Cross carefully catalogued every page of the recruitment report. Reed disappeared without saying much, though I suspected he was checking the building's perimeter for the third time that night. Evie never stopped working. The rhythmic tapping of her keyboard echoed faintly down the hallway, long after everyone else had fallen silent. I carried a cup of coffee onto the roof. Washington looked peaceful from that height. The city lights stretched toward the horizon, hiding the machinery of government beneath an illusion of calm. Somewhere among those buildings were the people responsible for Martin Voss's death. Somewhere else was Selene Ward. For the first time since joining Mara's task force, I began to understand how impossible our mission really was. We weren't searching for a person. We were searching for someone who had spent decades avoiding people exactly like us. The rooftop door opened behind me. Without turning around, I recognized the footsteps. Mara. She stopped beside the railing and looked out over the city. "I figured I'd find you here," she started. "I couldn't sleep." I said, "I wasn't expecting you to." For a while we simply stood together in silence. Finally she asked, "What aren't you telling me?" The question surprised me. "What makes you think I'm holding something back?" "You hesitated when you described the man in the archive." I smiled to myself. "You notice everything," I observed. "It's part of the job," she responded. I nodded. He wasn't afraid. "Of us?" she asked. "Of anything." I stared toward the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. "I've interviewed cartel leaders, serial offenders, foreign intelligence officers. They all have tells. Tiny moments where their confidence slips." I shook my head. "He never slipped." "What does that mean?" she inquired. "I'm not sure." I thought back to our conversation. He wasn't trying to escape. He stayed. He wanted me to leave. Mara looked over at me. "You think he knew those agents were coming?" "I know he did," I replied. "And he stayed anyway." I nodded, almost like... The realization settled into place as I spoke. Almost like protecting that file mattered more than protecting himself. Neither of us said anything for several moments. Then Mara quietly asked, "Do you trust him?" I laughed softly. "No." She smiled. "Good." "Do you?" I asked. "No." She folded her arms against the cool night air. "But I trust Martin Voss." I looked at her. "He trusted that man enough to leave something in his care." She nodded toward the conference room below. "And Martin died making sure we kept looking." Before I could respond, Evie's voice crackled through the small radio clipped to Mara's jacket. "Mara, Noah, I need you downstairs." There was urgency in her voice, not panic, discovery. We hurried back into the operations room where Evie had already projected several surveillance photographs across the wall. "I ran facial recognition on everyone entering and leaving the courthouse today," she explained. "Nothing." She changed the image. "So I expanded the search." Another photograph appeared, then another. Different locations, different years, different cities, the same maintenance worker, standing outside a courthouse in Chicago, walking through Union Station in Washington, leaving a federal archive in Denver, always in the background, always wearing different clothes, always looking exactly the same. The oldest photograph carried a date in the lower corner. May 12th, 1987. Cross stepped closer to the screen. "That's impossible." Evie nodded. "I thought so too." She pressed another key. A final photograph filled the wall. Black and white, grainy, taken sometime in the late 1960s. The same man, standing beside a younger Martin Voss. Neither appeared aware the picture had been taken. The room fell completely silent. Reed finally broke it. "So," he looked toward me. "Who exactly did you meet today?" No one answered, because no one knew. Far beyond the windows of the safe house, unnoticed by everyone inside, a man stood across the street beneath the glow of a bus stop shelter. His hands rested casually on a folded newspaper. He watched the lights burning inside the operations room for another few seconds before quietly turning away. No one saw him leave. No one realized he had been there at all. Except for just a moment. I looked toward the window. I wasn't sure why. I only knew that for the briefest instant. I had the unmistakable feeling that someone had been watching us. Then the feeling was gone.
Chapter 10. The Observer, the Teacher. There is a misconception that has survived nearly as long as the gift itself. People believe power belongs to the one who acts. Kings believed it, generals believed it, governments still believe it. They are almost always wrong. Power has never belonged to the one who moves first. It belongs to the one who waits until everyone else has committed themselves. For 3 centuries I have watched empires mistake motion for progress. They race toward answers, convinced that urgency is the same as purpose. Then they wonder why history continues repeating itself. History does not repeat. People do. Noah Mercer took his first step today. He believes he followed a man carrying a toolbox through the halls of a federal courthouse. In truth, he followed a question. One that has remained unanswered for far longer than he can imagine. The man he met has served many masters in his lifetime. Some sought knowledge, others sought control. A few believed those were the same thing. Martin Voss understood that before he died. Selene understood it long before him. Whether Noah will remains to be seen. The file now resting inside that safe house is valuable, but not for the reason they believe. Documents have a curious way of surviving those who create them. Every generation assumes it is the first to uncover forgotten truths, never realizing someone before them chose to leave those truths behind. That is the difference between a secret and a legacy. Meridian spent decades collecting names, observing families, measuring behaviors they could never fully explain. They believed that if they gathered enough information, they would eventually understand the gift. Instead, they only proved that it existed. There are some things no institution can possess, only witness. That has always frustrated men who mistake ownership for understanding. I wonder how many of them finally realized the difference. The task force has begun asking better questions. That is encouraging. It is also dangerous. Questions have a way of attracting attention, especially from those who have spent lifetimes ensuring they are never asked. The people watching Mara and her team are not reacting out of fear. Fear is predictable. This is something else. Recognition. They have begun to understand what I understood the moment Mara first reached beyond herself. She is not searching for the truth. She is pulling the truth toward her. There is a difference. It is why Selene found the others before Meridian ever could. It is why Nathaniel was never truly lost. And it is why the hunt has changed. Until now, Mara's team believed they were pursuing shadows left behind by an old conspiracy. They were mistaken. The shadows have been watching them since the very beginning. And somewhere, hidden behind another borrowed face, someone has already made a decision. It is finally time for me to step into the light.